thank you for joining us for this, the fourth day in Challenge Poverty Week, and for this short seminar come workshop arising from the Life on the Breadline, Christianity, Poverty and Politics in the 21st Century research project that's just concluded, that we've been pleased to have Church Action on Poverty as our key project partner. It's good to see you today, and I want to start by saying a little bit about the research that we've done in the Life on the Breadline research project, and then to talk a little bit about one or two of the insights that have arisen from our research as they relate particularly to Christian anti-poverty activism, and then thirdly to say a word or two about one particular resource, the Anti-Poverty Charter, that we have developed during the project and want to offer as a resource, amongst others, to people within the churches and beyond to root anti-poverty activism locally. I won't linger too long on this slide, but it's worth occasionally pausing and reflecting on the big picture, the picture of poverty in 2021. Our project, Life on the Breadline, has focused on Christian anti-poverty activism in the UK since the 2008 financial crash, during the so-called age of austerity. But we know that that picture, that pattern of endemic structural poverty, wasn't born with the financial crash and didn't end when austerity was, apparently, declared at an end, or coming to an end, by former Prime Minister Theresa May. We know that the last 18 months of the COVID pandemic have deepened and intensified the pattern of poverty in the UK. As I've been speaking, you may well have been glancing down that list of stats, many of which you will be familiar with, but it's worth reminding ourselves that we're living in 2021 in a society where more than 14 million people are living in poverty, a society where Trust for Trust has given out over the last 12 months, approximately 1.9 million food parcels. We live in a society where approximately 1 million people are surviving on 0 hours contracts, and where COVID has plunged millions more people into poverty, not helped, as we've seen in recent days, by the clawing back of the £20 a week universal credit payment. I'm not going to linger on this slide, but we've seen the picture there. Poverty is as intense, if not more intense, in the UK in 2021 than it was when this project began in 2018. Poverty, as we've discovered, is like a jigsaw. It's intersectional, it's systemic. The impact of austerity is unequal in spite of what our politicians have told us down through the years. And poverty is violent, it's traumatic, it damages individuals, families and communities. So something about the nature of poverty before moving on to a focus on our research in Life on the Breadline. Martin Luther King is perhaps justifiably best known for his work on racial justice and civil rights in the United States. But it's sometimes not recognised that Martin Luther King's work also focused on the intersection between racism and poverty. Here you'll see a short clip from Martin Luther King's Nobel Peace Prize speech in 1964, where King talks about poverty, comparing it to a monstrous octopus reaching its tentacles into the different corners of our lives and the different parts of our world. Kimberly Crenshaw, an academic from the United States, began writing in the late 1980s about what she referred to as intersectionality. Crenshaw was writing about the experience of African American women in relation to racism and sexism in particular. But she talked about the way in which those women experienced different forms of oppression that were compounding one another. The image you see on the screen is our nod within Life on the Breadline to the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. We can only understand poverty in the UK if we recognise that it is intersectional, if we recognise that it has many faces and many aspects. We cannot reduce poverty to food banks, in other words. Poverty is bigger and broader and more difficult to grab hold of. So that's the first thing to say. Poverty is intersectional. Secondly, in spite of the language used by George Osborne more than a decade ago, comparing some people living in poverty to skivers and others to strivers, echoes of that infamous deserving, undeserving poor dichotomy. References to the Channel 4 so-called comedy, Shameless, which was about a family apparently living at large on benefits by David Cameron. During the Blair years, during the Cameron years, and through to Johnson's years, government after government has arguably presented poverty as something that arises from individual inadequacy or moral inadequacy. What we want to say in Life on the Breadline is that poverty is the result of structural injustice, not individual inadequacy. What Gustavo Gutierrez refers to as systemic sin, what the pioneer of peace studies, Johan Galton, refers to as structural violence. Consequently, austerity wasn't, as we were told, a necessity, but an ideologically inspired political choice. That ideologically inspired political choice to develop a series of austerity policies more than a decade ago was accompanied by a claim on the part of George Osborne that we're all in this together. And arguably, from George Osborne to Rishi Sunak, Chancellor of the Exchequer after Chancellor of the Exchequer, who have presided over this age of austerity, have claimed that somehow we are all bearing the burden of austerity together. Archbishop Canterbury, Justin Welby, nails that myth when he reminds us that austerity is a theory for the rich, but a daily reality for the poor. So the £20 reduction in universal credit that so many of us have been rightly up in arms about is nothing to those government ministers who believe that withdrawing it makes it more likely that people are going to go out and find all those jobs that are well paid and plentiful. So we are removed from austerity, but Justin Welby says that it is a daily reality for people living in poverty. And that daily reality has been something that has hit us as a society unequally. Women, single parents, black and Asian British communities, and people with disabilities have been far harder hit than people that look like me. Gustavo Gutierrez points to the structural violence of poverty when he says that poverty means death, lack of food and housing, the exploitation of workers and permanent unemployment. Poverty, according to Mahatma Gandhi, is the worst form of violence. So on the basis of those reflections on the nature of poverty, very brief reflections necessarily, let me say a word or two now about Life on the Breadline. Our 3-year research project was the first academic theology project in the UK to analyse the impact of austerity policies on Christian anti-poverty activism in the UK since the financial crash. Along with our project partners, Church Action on Poverty, we've developed a series of 6 case studies, 2 in London, 2 in Manchester, 2 in Birmingham, focusing on different issues relating to poverty and Christian anti-poverty engagement. We've undertaken more than 60 activist interviews, about 6 or 7 focus groups, interviewed national church leaders, about 18 national church leaders, and surveyed 120 regional church leaders, as well as having hundreds and hundreds of informal conversations in London, Birmingham and Manchester. The project has now technically come to an end, and you can find out a bit more about the work that we've begun and are continuing to develop on the Life on the Breadline website, or if you're on social media, if you're on Twitter, for example, searching for hashtag Breadline Research. So that's something general about Life on the Breadline. We've been keen in the project to try and communicate to as many different audiences as possible. And so one of the things that we've done is to work with an animation company to make a series of short animations. The animation I want to show you now is one of 3. It's just 2.5 minutes long, but it gives you a flavour of some of the insights that have arisen from 3 of our Life on the Breadline case studies. Let's watch it together now.
In the summer of 2017, the Grenfell fire killed 72 men, women and children. Faith groups such as the Notting Hill Methodist Church are rooted in the community and trusted by people in North Kensington. As a result, they were able to offer an inclusive pastoral response to the tragedy and to continue campaigning for housing justice, an issue which largely affects people living in poverty. Austerity has decimated youth services in Britain, stripping away vital support for vulnerable young people. Power the Fight is a youth empowerment organisation in London supported by Black Pentecostal and evangelical churches. Originally established to address knife crime, the organisation has expanded into mentoring, therapeutic care, training, advocacy and political engagement. This addresses the vulnerability of young people from black and dual heritage backgrounds from economically deprived communities to criminalisation, educational exclusion and poverty. The Firs and Bromford estate in Birmingham is in the top 10% of deprived neighbourhoods in England. However, as our research discovered through their use of asset-based community development, the people of Hodge Hill Church and their neighbours respond to need on the estate by focusing on people's gifts and long-term relationships. This is an incarnational approach to partnership-based social action, theology and discipleship. The challenge with this approach to poverty is how to also address structural injustices. Our case studies show how Christians have been advocates, invested in people's gifts and addressed many aspects of poverty. However, as our Life on the Breadline research has shown, a commitment to feeding the hungry that leaves unjust social structures intact will not be enough to make poverty history. It is time for the Church to use its unrivalled social capital to live up to its calling, to transform structural injustice.
That video raises some questions and offers some reflections from 3 of our 6 Life on the Breadline case studies. There'll be further animation coming soon. So before turning to the specific resource that I'm wanting to talk to you about in a few moments, the Anti-Poverty Charter, let me say a word or 2 about some of the insights that have arisen from our Life on the Breadline research that I hope can help us to challenge poverty, not just during this Challenge Poverty Week, but across the months and across the years. Arising from our 6 case studies and interviews with local, regional and national church leaders, we've identified at least 5 different approaches to Christian engagement with poverty, some of which we might call anti-poverty activism, some of which we might see in far more welfare-based or charity-based terms. It's important to stress that even though these are presented on the screen as 5 separate boxes, they're not hermetically sealed. These are not the ideal types, much beloved by some of my social science colleagues. These are fluid approaches to engaging with poverty and people who are experiencing poverty. Having said that, we've identified these 5 approaches arising from our extensive research. There is the dominant approach to Christian action on poverty, the welfare-based or the charity-based approach, the Matthew 25 approach, if you like, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger. The dominant position, which meets people in their immediate need and cares for individuals and seeks to embrace and include all, so that all people may experience the flourishing that is our right, as it were, as people made in the image of God. We've seen that in our B30 food bank case study, one of the largest food banks in the UK, a Trussell Trust food bank based at a large ecumenical church in South Birmingham. We've seen it in the ways in which our colleagues and friends at Hodge Hill Church in Birmingham have drawn on asset-based community development to build a sense of community in that part of East Birmingham as a response to austerity and as a way of building a more inclusive community. We've seen it in the response that friends at Notting Hill Methodist Church and other faith communities made on the night of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and in the weeks and months and years since. A second approach to engaging with poverty that we've encountered in Life on the Breadline is what you might call empowerment. This is a far more kind of individualised approach. It's an approach that some, not all, but some evangelical churches have traditionally adopted, focused very much around the uplift of individuals, not least through education. We see that in the work of Power the Fight. We see that in the work of Hodge Hill. We also see it potentially in the empowering voice, coming from a different theological position, but in the empowerment work of networks like Church Action on Poverty that are intending to and find ways, together with others, to give voice to the experience of poverty, to work alongside the experts by experience, to give voice to and create a context within people can articulate their agency and their own sense of power and presence. The third approach that we've encountered in Life on the Breadline is what you might call social enterprise, the support that Christian churches and NGOs give to the development of small-scale social enterprises. An example of that would be something called Gear Up, a bicycle maintenance business social enterprise in Hodge Hill in Birmingham. We see it in the work of Power the Fight, supporting community businesses, particularly amongst people living in poverty. Then fourth, advocacy, perhaps one of the approaches to poverty that we've seen most in the interviews we've done with church leaders, the church as an institution, locally, regionally or nationally, in inverted commas, speaking on behalf of or speaking out against or speaking truth to power. We see that in the work of Notting Hill Methodist Church and the involvement of the church in the Shelter Commission's report on public housing and homelessness in the UK, advocating for the community that were tragically traumatised as a result of the Grenfell tragedy, and advocating on behalf of housing justice. And there's a connection there with the work of Church Action on Poverty, not least Church Action's involvement down through the years in initiatives like End Hunger UK. We see that too in the work of B30 Food Bank, where food banks have moved to what you might call a Food Bank Plus model, very much working with different professionals and different practitioners to provide legal and housing and welfare advice and advocating on behalf of people that use the food bank. And then finally, we've seen the campaigning approach, which Church Action on Poverty, Notting Hill Methodist Church, Power the Fight, in relation to things like a real living wage, in relation to things like housing injustice, in relation to the connection between the decimation of youth services, rising social exclusion and growing levels of serious youth violence. Just some insights from our Life on the Breadline case studies. More can be found in our Policy Makers report, which has just recently been released, and in our forthcoming Church Leaders report, which should be ready and available fairly soon. So moving on from those insights, those are lessons that we have learned. Those are ways in which the church has demonstrated itself to be in the vanguard of the struggle to engage with and defeat austerity age poverty over the last decade. And it is vital, as we've seen in our Life on the Breadline research, to affirm and applaud the incredible support that the church has given and continues to give to millions of people across the UK. It's also important, however, on the basis of our research, to raise critical questions. Churches committed themselves not just to feeding the hungry, but to transforming structural injustice within what were referred to as the marks of mission that emerged out of the 1980s. We recognise that there is a strong commitment to what's often referred to as the common good, a strong commitment to values that emerged from Latin American liberation theology, to God's preferential option for the poor, and the consequent commitment laid on people of faith to mirror God's option for the poor with a preferential option for the poor on behalf of the work of the church. However, in spite of that, in our church leader interviews, we found some very strong sense that many churches, in spite of the work they do, have been and continue to be disengaged from, cushioned from, the raw impact of austerity, doing good to the poor, as it were, rather than working alongside people living in poverty, because the impact of austerity has not hit a number of our congregations who are slightly more affluent. That was one insight that arose. So is the church disengaged from austerity? Secondly, has the church used its voice, its prophetic voice, to campaign for structural change in a sustained and assertive enough manner? We would argue that the church has not spoken truth to power in as consistent or as coherent or as sustained a manner as is needed. Perhaps the church needs to live up to that calling if we are to make poverty history. We need also to bring a focus on poverty into the heart of church life so that it is not just seen as part of the work that those who are interested in so-called social responsibility are part of. Focus on poverty needs to play a part in church decisions about staffing, finance, buildings, where we place our churches. It needs to be at the heart of the church's understanding of itself. But we've also lived through an age, haven't we, when poverty has been normalised. Churches have an immense resource in that we gather together on a weekly basis in worship. We gather together to read our Bibles. That resource, the gathering together around the Bible, the gathering together to worship, can be a way of challenging, needs to be a way of challenging the normalising of poverty far more consistently than has been the case to date. So in light of that, we were very keen that the work that we've been doing in Life on the Breadline has an impact at grassroots level, has an impact on the life and the work of the church. So one of the resources that we developed, many others can be found on our project website, such as our Life on the Breadline Lent course for 2022. One of the resources that we hope will be useful is what we call the Anti-Poverty Charter. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, not long before he was murdered by the Nazis, said that the church is not simply called to bind up the wounds of the broken beneath the wheels of injustice, but to ram a spoke into the wheel itself. Research needs to be seen as a force for progressive social change. So as researchers involved in Life on the Breadline, we were committed to developing research that can be used and adapted to help to generate positive social change as a force for social justice. So on the basis of that conviction, in conversation with church leaders, local Christians, people experiencing poverty, our case study partners over the last 3 years, conversations earlier this year at the National Poverty Consultation, and in collaboration with Church Action on Poverty, we have developed our Anti-Poverty Charter, which is living on the Life on the Breadline website, and we hope will provide a really useful, user-friendly resource for individuals and congregations and circuits and districts and dioceses and national churches to address poverty locally. The resource can guide our reflections and actions at a local level. The resource is rooted in fundamental gospel values, and we hope offers a variety of practical suggestions that people might consider as forms of anti-poverty activism in our local communities. And that's the point. This is not an anti-poverty charter that we are bequeathing to the church and saying, here is the blueprint, do it this way. What we're doing is saying, here is a resource, the Anti-Poverty Charter, we believe can stimulate effective local reflection, effective local contextualized action on poverty. But it has to be adapted, it has to be taken and adapted to our local context. And that's why we've made it very short, just a couple of sides of A4. So if folk in your area would rather have a paper copy of the Anti-Poverty Charter, there's one PDF on the website that can be downloaded, printed, and it's perfect for notice boards. Easy to download and share. So that's the end of the advert there. So some of the actions that we are suggesting are that people might want to sign up to the Charter on the Life on the Breadline website. I've spoken very briefly about just one or two of the insights that have arisen from our 3 years of research. But you might want, as a way of helping your group or your church or your congregation to focus much more consistently and coherently on poverty, to invite one of the Life on the Breadline team to come and speak at your church or your local group. You can use our austerity timeline to find out more about government policies, or the Charter as a stimulus for Bible studies or worship. Use the Life on the Breadline Lent course in collaboration with the Anti-Poverty Charter to help you to develop local actions, some of which could include developing a community profile that is focused on issues of poverty and inequality in your neighbourhood, that can help you to campaign locally for issues like a real living wage. And although action begins locally, we all know that the wider we spread the word, the further we spread the word, the more of an impact we can have. So think about sending the Anti-Poverty Charter to your neighbours, to your church leaders, locally, regionally and nationally. We hope that it can have a real impact and be part of the journey that we are all committed to as we seek to challenge poverty here in the UK. Thanks very much indeed. It's been really good to share with you.